Welcome to Leaping Larry's Revolutionary Reading Theatre.
Welcome in, everybody, to the Larry's Reading Theater. And of course, today we are reading from Stalin, History and Critique of a Black Legend, Domenico Losurdo. And we are on, well, they don't label the chapter, so we're on the next chapter, The Complex and Contradictory Course of the Stalin Era. If you're watching this on the YouTube, Come see me on the Kick sometime. I stream every day live on Kick. From around, I start at least 2 p.m. Atlantic time and I go for, 8 hours. Yeah, today we're reading the part called The Complex and Contradictory Course of the Stalin Era. From the Revival of Soviet Democracy to St. Bartholomew's Night. It must be reiterated anyway, as one of the authors of the Black Book of Communism contradictorily acknowledges, that it is necessary to insert in the long term of Russian history first the Bolshevik, then the Stalinist period of political violence. It is necessary not to lose sight of the matrix out of which Stalinism emerged, which was the period of the First World War, of the revolutions of 1917, and of the civil wars taken as a whole. And so, born ideally, when no one could foresee Stalin coming to power, and even before the Bolshevik Revolution, Stalinism is not primarily the result either of an individual's thirst for power or of an ideology, but rather of a permanent state of exception that has been afflicting Russia since 1914. As we have seen, from as early as the beginning of the 19th century, very different personalities did not fail to notice the premonitory signs of the unprecedented storm that was gathering over the country between Europe and Asia, and which began to manifest itself in all its violence with the outbreak of the First World War. It is from here, and from the long, very long duration of the Second Time of Troubles, that we must start. The fact that we are dealing with a phenomenon that unfolds in anything but a unilinear manner is not a coincidence. We will see it diminish at times of relative normalization and manifest itself in all its harshness when the state of exception reaches its peak. Let us begin by asking a preliminary question. From what moment can one speak of a personal and solitary dictatorship for Soviet Russia? Authoritative historians seem to agree on one essential point. In the early 1930s, Stalin was not yet an autocrat. He was not exempt from having to contend with criticism, dissent, and outright opposition within the Communist Party. The Leninist tradition of party dictatorship and of oligarchic power persisted. That was said by Tucker in 1990. The historians quoted here use the two categories indifferently. However, the latter is ill suited to a regime that stimulates a very strong social premonition of the subordinate classes and that forcibly introduces into the political and cultural life of the country's social strata and ethnic groups that until then had been completely marginalized. The fact remains that in any case, from 1937 and the outbreak of the Great Terror, the party dictatorship gave way to autocracy. Should we then distinguish two phases within Stalinism? While having the merit of questioning the usual monolithic view, this periodization does not constitute a real step forward in the understanding of those years. The passage from the first to the second phase and the concrete configuration of both would remain to be explained in any case. To understand the problem, let us look at what happened in the mid-1920s. At a time when, having overcome the acute crisis represented by foreign intervention and civil war, the NEP had already achieved significant results. Not only was there no autocracy, but while the dictatorship of the Communist Party remained in place, the management of power tended in some ways to become more liberal, quote unquote. Bukharin seems to go so far as to claim a sort of rule of law. Quote, the peasant must have before him Soviet order, Soviet right, Soviet law, and not Soviet arbitrariness, moderated by a Bureau of Complaints, whose whereabouts is unknown. Firm legal norms are needed, binding even on the communists. The state must now engage in peaceful organizational work, and the party, in its relation with the masses, must stand for persuasion and only for persuasion. Unquote. Terror no longer made sense. Its time has passed. Instead, it is matter of leaving room for mass initiative. In this context, one must look favorably on the thriving of people's associations and voluntary organizations. We are not in the presence of merely personal opinions. These are the years of the Duumvirate. Bukharin manages the power together with Stalin, who in 1925 also repeatedly stated that the survivals of war communism in the countryside must be eliminated, and condemns the deviation which sounds the alarm for an imaginary restoration of capitalism and leads to a revival of class struggle in the countryside and the civil war in our country. Instead, it is necessary to realize that we have entered the period of economic construction. Oh, we have a bunch of Stalin quotes here. Yeah. To shift of emphasis from class struggle to economic development also had important consequences on the political level. The first task of communist students was to master science. Only in this way would they aspire to take on a leading role. Qualifications were needed. We must have concrete, specific leadership. And therefore, to give real leadership, one must know the work. One must study the work conscientiously, patiently, and perseveringly. Stalin, again. The centrality of economic development, and therefore of complete competence, makes the party's monopoly less rigid. Quote, it is indispensable that the communist behaves towards the non-party people as equals. All the more so since the control of the party members by those non-party people can produce very positive results. On the whole, according to Stalin, a radical political change was necessary. It is now no longer possible to lead in the military fashion. What we need now is not the utmost pressure, but the utmost flexibility in both policy and organization, the utmost flexibility in both political and organizational leadership. Stalin again. It is necessary to commit ourselves to grasp and to grasp sympathetically the requirements and needs of the workers and the peasants. Even with regard to the peasants, who are often more backward than the workers, the task of the communists and the cadres is to learn to convince the peasants, sparing neither time nor effort for this purpose. It is not about acquiring a more effective political, it is not just about acquiring a more effective political education. It is necessary to put an end to purely formal elections, piloted from above, and to the malpractice that entails the lack of control, the abuse of power, and arbitrariness of administrators. A change is needed. The old election practices in quite a number of districts were survival of war communism, and they had to be abolished as harmful and utterly rotten. Unquote. Who's this again? Stalin? Yeah. Still, this whole page is Stalin still. It was time to pursue the line of revitalizing the Soviets, the line of transforming the Soviets into genuinely elected bodies, the line of implementing the principles of Soviet democracy in the countryside. Even before October, the Soviets had begun to transform themselves into bureaucratic structures, and the assemblies began to decline in frequency in attendance. But then, restored to their original function, the Soviets were tasked with drawing the working people into the daily work of governing the state. Quote, it takes place through organizations based on mass initiative. All kinds of commissions and committees, conferences and delegate meetings that spring up around the Soviets, economic bodies, factory committees, cultural institutions, party organizations, youth league organizations, all kinds of cooperative associations, and so on, and so forth. Our comrades sometimes fail to see that around the low units of our party, Soviet, cultural, trade union, educational, YCL, and army organizations, around the departments for work among women, and all other kinds of organizations, there are whole teeming anthills, organizations, commissions, and conferences which have sprung up of their own accord and embrace millions of non-party workers and peasants, anthills which, by their daily, inconspicuous, painstaking quiet work, provide the basis and the life of the Soviets, the source of strength of the Soviet state. Unquote. And that was Stalin. For all those reasons, it is wrong to identify the party with the state. Indeed, to proceed in this way is to distort Lenin's thought. On the other hand, once the position of the new state is consolidated domestically and internationally, it is necessary to, quote, extend the constitution to the entire population, including the bourgeoisie, unquote. At that time, echoing some of the formulations used by Marx at the time of the celebration of the Paris Commune, Stalin looked with the interest at the ideal of the withering and even extinction of the state apparatus. The reactivation of the Soviets and political participation was intended to be a step in that direction. The task was to reconstruct our state apparatus, to link it with the masses of the people, to make it sound honest, simple, and inexpensive. Associations arising from civil society should also be encouraged, which embrace millions, which unite the Soviets with the rank and file, which merge the state apparatus with the vast masses and, step by step, destroy everything that serves as a barrier between the state apparatus and the people. In other words, the dictatorship of the proletariat is not an end in itself. The dictatorship is a means, a way of achieving socialism. But what is socialism? Socialism is the transition from a society with the dictatorship of the proletariat to a stateless society. Not the end, certainly, but nevertheless a perceptible loosening of the dictatorship of the proletariat and the party seem to be the order of the day. This line of openness, common to Bakunin and Stalin, but branded by Zhivkov followers as a kind of middle peasant Bolshevism, was followed by the crisis that led to the liquidation of the NEP, to the forced collectivization of agriculture, and to the industrialization in 4 stages, with the consequent radical expansion of the concentrationary universe. The turning point was not, as is often claimed, the ideological fury of the ruling group, i.e., the eagerness to liquidate all forms of private property in the market. At the same time, the pressure coming from below should not be underestimated. In not insignificant sectors of society, there was a nostalgia for the egalitarianism that existed before the introduction of the NEP. Then, there is another element. Almost as if responding to the type of reading dominant today, on the 19th of November, 1928, Stalin declared that the Soviet Union was run by sober and calm people. Anxious, however, about the problem of how to defend the independence of a country, decidedly more backward than the potential enemies around it. There was concern about the international situation perceived as increasingly threatening. At the end of November 1925, the Treaty of Locarno was signed, bringing France and Germany closer together. It recomposed the rift between the Western powers that had confronted each other during the First World War, and thus facilitated the isolation of the USSR. And there was no shortage of voices calling for a European crusade against communism. And so, in Moscow, leading figures such as Zhivkov, Radek, and Kamenev dramatically underlined the danger of aggression that was looming. A few months later came the coup d'etat that sealed the rise to power in Poland of Pilsudski, who had concentration camps of his own, by the way. A sworn enemy of the Soviet Union. In his studio, David's Napoleon crossing the Alps was in full view. And in reality, Pilsudski also admired Napoleon for his invasion of Russia. That last campaign had seen Polish participation. The new strongman of Warsaw proudly underlined this, aspiring to wrest Ukraine from the USSR, to make it a faithful and subordinate ally. On August 24th, 1926, Pilsudski rejected Moscow's proposal for a non-aggression treaty. And later, the Soviet foreign minister denounced Poland's plans to, quote, acquire a protectorate over the Baltic countries, unquote. The following year, the international picture became even bleaker. Britain, broke off trade and diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union, and Marshal Ferdinand Foch called on France to do likewise. In Peking, the USSR embassy was raided by Chiang Kai shek's troops, possibly aided by London, at least according to the suspicion nurtured in Moscow. Probably true, though. Let's be real, probably true, though. While in Warsaw, the Soviet ambassador was assassinated by a white Russian emigre. Finally, an explosion took place in Leningrad at a Communist Party headquarters. At this point, it is for Tukhachevsky himself, Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces, to sound the alarm bell and demand a rapid mobilization of the modernization of the army. The NEP no longer seemed able to solve the problem. Yes, the economy was showing signs of recovery, and in 1926-27 it had returned to pre-war levels. But as far as industrial production and technology were concerned, the gap with the advanced capitalist economies had remained unchanged. Decisive or drastic measures were required. And military circles pressed for similar measures in agriculture as well, in order to ensure regular food supplies for the front. As we can see, the turnabout of 1929 was not the product of Stalin's whim. On the contrary, Stalin had to, if not contain, then at least channel the pressure coming from military circles, rejecting the fanciful demands, the objectives, demanded primarily by Tukhachevsky. Stalin warned against red militarism, which by focusing exclusively on armaments industry risks compromising economic development and consequently the modernization of the military apparatus as a whole. Nor was the turnabout the result of ideological dogma, over and above the power of the Communist Party and the social relations in force in the USSR. The existence of the nation was at stake. This was the conviction of a large part of the Soviet leadership, starting with Stalin. The alarm bells seemed all the more justified in view of the fact that the darkening international horizon, both diplomatically and economically, 1929 was the year of the Great Depression, this was intertwined with the grain crisis. The sharp drop in the quantity of wheat put on the markets by the peasants. Food queues sprang up in the cities, and this caused a further worsening of conditions. It was a situation that could only work against Bakurinist policies, his biographer rightly observes. It was at this point that the fate of the Triumvirate was sealed. The rupture cannot be explained only by the moral scruples of a defeated member of the Triumvirate, who clearly foresaw a St. Bartholomew's Night that would be caused by the forced collectivization of agriculture. What caused the split was above all another element. Bakurin was also seriously concerned about the danger of war, but he did not believe that a solution could be found in the purely national sphere. Quote, "The final practical victory of socialism in our country is not possible without the help of other countries and the world revolution." Unquote. The Bolshevik leader, who had already condemned the Peace of Brest-Litovsk as a cowardly and nationalist desertion from the cause of international struggle of the revolutionary proletariat, continued to hold this view of internationalism. Quote, "If we exaggerate our possibility, there then could arise a tendency to spit, quote unquote, on the international revolution. Such a tendency could give rise to its own special ideology, a peculiar national Bolshevism, quote unquote, or something else in that spirit. Oh dear. From here, it is a few small steps to a number of even more harmful ideas. Unquote. Stalin, on the other hand, started more realistically from the assumption that stabilization in the capitalist world had taken place. The defense of the USSR was primarily a national task. It was not only a question of promoting the industrialization of the country in 4 stages, as the grain crisis showed. The flow of foodstuffs from the countryside to the city and to the army was far from guaranteed. This problem was particularly sensitive to a leader such as Stalin, who, on the basis of a rich experience accumulated during the Civil War, had repeatedly stressed the primary importance in a future conflict of the stability of the rear and of food supplies from the countryside. Here are the conclusions that emerged from a letter to Lenin and an interview with Pravda in the summer and autumn of 1918, respectively. Quote, "The food question is naturally bound up with the military question. In other words, an army cannot exist for long without a strong rear. For the front to be firm, it is necessary that the army should regularly receive replenishments, munitions, and food from the rear." Unquote. Even on the eve of Hitler's aggression, Stalin was to pay great attention to agriculture, pointing to it as a central element of national defense. It can be understood then why, at the end of the 1920s, the collectivization of agriculture appeared to be an obligatory way to dramatically accelerate the industrialization of the country and to ensure in a stable way the supplies that the cities and the army needed, all anticipation of war. Indeed, quote, "Leaving aside the human costs, the economic achievements of the first 5-year plan were astonishing. By increasing industrial production by 250%, Soviet Russia took giant steps towards becoming a major industrial power. Obviously, the great leap forward in Soviet Russia's industrial economy entailed a great leap forward in its military sector. Armaments expenditure rising 5-fold between 1929 and 1940. Unquote. More modest results were achieved in agriculture, where overcoming the subsistence economy and centralization nonetheless created more favorable conditions to furnish regular supplies for a large army. From socialist democratism to the Great Terror. Having overcome the St. Bartholomew's Night constituted by the forced collectivization of agriculture, with the horrible social and human costs it entailed, the policy of openness that we already know seems to be making its appearance once again. After the victory over the kulaks, Kaganovich observed in September 1934, it was necessary to bring our measures into legal frameworks and to educate our population in the framework of socialist awareness of the law. Unquote. Indeed, without mass education of our entire people of 160 million in the spirit of legal awareness, the consolidation of our order would not be possible. Unquote. Sorry, not end quote yet. This is all the more necessary because Stalin reiterates in the USSR, there are no longer any antagonistic classes. Unquote. And this part is important because actually, you know what? I'm just going to pause right here for 1 second because a lot of people mistake that with the same mistake Khrushchev did in making a state of all classes. And really this is true because although class struggle does not end, it does put an end to that to that other certain class. What you then have to deal with is the hangovers that are left over from dealing with that class for a very long time, for many generations. There is a Kim Jong-il quote that deals with this. Let me see if I can. This is sort of the Kim Jong-il quote here that expands on Stalin's quote that we just read right here, where Stalin reiterates in the USSR, quote, "There are no longer any antagonistic classes." He said that in another speech before, too, during an election, which we looked at. And just to look here, this is what Kim Jong-il says, sort of expanding on that, right? It doesn't mean that class struggle ends. It does. It just means that as a class, the dynamic has completely changed. And class struggle changes in the sense that now the working people have the upper hand, in that they have the state, right? Their state apparatus, with their new central and local organs. So Kim Jong-il says the phrase, "the masses of people," assumes a class character in class society. An exploiter society is divided into exploiter class and the exploited class, or the ruling class and the ruled class, depending on who owns the means of production and who controls state power. The exploited class, the ruled class, forms the majority of the masses of the people. The class structure of the masses of the people is not immutable. It changes as social history develops. In capitalist society, not only workers and peasants, but also working intellectuals and many other classes and strata which champion and struggle for independence form the masses of the people. In socialist society, all people are transformed into socialist working people, so everyone is a member of the masses of the people. Of course, in socialist society too, the maneuvers of minor hostile elements continue and traitors may appear in the revolutionary ranks. Therefore, it is also necessary in socialist society to clearly distinguish between the masses of the people and the elements hostile to them. That's an interesting quote that makes you think about how you have to change that identification, the new way that you have to identify this. Because again, even former sections of the bourgeoisie, or the petty bourgeoisie, in a socialist society have now been, as he points out, turned into socialist working people. Think about this in terms of China now, and China's development. Okay. Now to continue. And hence there is no longer any reason for the delay in the introduction of universal, direct, and equal suffrage with secret ballot. Of universal suffrage without any restriction. The amendments to the new Constitution, which propose to deprive the clergy, ex-white guards, all exes, and persons who do not perform work of public duty, of electoral rights, must therefore be rejected. Nor does it make any sense to grant these people only the right to elect, but not that of being elected, unquote. Just as it makes sense to reject the proposal to prohibit the celebration of religious ceremonies. It is now possible to advance towards socialist democratization. This is not just about propaganda, which certainly plays an important role. We are in the presence of a perspective that arouses the harsh polemics of Trotsky, who in Stalin's Liberalism identifies and brands the abandonment of the Soviet system and the return to bourgeois democracy, in the context of which class differences have been removed. The subject is constituted by the citizen in its abstraction. This turning point is well understood. The first concerns of the Soviet autocracy is to get rid of the worker and Red Army Soviets. The antithesis between the two perspectives is clear. Stalin had no interest in further exacerbating political and social conflict. Once it was possible, given the Communist Party's ability to exercise directorial powers, to banish threats to the country's independence posed by backward countryside, hegemonized by kulaks and capable of blocking city and arms supplies. It was his own insistence on industrialization in 4 stages that prompted him to urge the promotion of non-party elements to positions of responsibility in the factory and in society. It was to him inadmissible to assume an exclusionary attitude towards them. There is nothing more stupid and more reactionary. Our policy does not by any means lie in converting the party into an exclusive caste. Every effort must be made to gain the country's specialists, engineers, and technicians of the old school for the cause of industrial and technological development. On the other hand, it was not possible to promote industrial and technological development without providing material incentives to train skilled workers and technicians. Hence, the polemic against the leftist leveling of wages. It was only by distancing oneself to a crude equalization of wages that it was possible to introduce a more efficient organization of labor, and to put an end to the fluctuation of the workforce, especially the most qualified, who moved from one factory to another in search of better and less flattened remuneration. In addition to egalitarianism and the objective discouragement of the most skilled and committed workers, incentive policy also had to put an end to the collective irresponsibility and instead introduce a principle of personal responsibility. It was precisely at this point that conditions were ripe for the outbreak of the Third Civil War, the one that tore apart the Bolsheviks themselves. Trotsky's stance against what he justifiably characterized as the neo-NDP was extremely harsh. Yes, in the Communist Party, according to Trotsky, there was an ever more accentuated turn to the right, with the favoring of the upper strata of the people, and the redemption of the kulaks. The bureaucracy is
ready to make economic concessions to the peasants, to their petty bourgeois interests and tendencies.
More generally, and as a consequence of the
turn towards the market and the monetary calculation
and the associated increase in the cost of living. Far from advancing towards socialism and the overcoming of inequalities and class division, Soviet society was more and more clearly characterized by new processes of class stratification, corresponding to the domestic involution. As far as international politics were concerned, there would have been a renunciation of all revolutionary and internationalist perspectives by the Soviet bureaucracy that had become purely national and conservative force, unquote. Now, the only guiding principles is that status quo, as was confirmed by the entry of the Soviet Union into the League of Nations. Does Trotsky sound familiar to anybody else? Obviously, neither Stalin nor Trotsky were unaware of the worsening international situation, but they provided different and contrasting answers to the problem. For the former, Stalin, it was a question of concentrating on Russia's economic and technological development, mending, as far as possible, the wounds caused by the October Revolution and the collectivization of the countryside, and presenting the Communist Party as the leader of the nation as a whole. The condition of stability and equilibrium thus achieved internally could at the same time make it possible to promote a policy of alliances at the international level, capable of guaranteeing the security of the USSR. In Trotsky's eyes, on the other hand, however impetuous the industrial development of Soviet Russia may be, it could ward off the aggression of the more advanced imperialist countries only with the support of the proletariat of the aggressor countries. And therefore, any accommodation with the bourgeoisie at a domestic and international level not only constituted a betrayal, but also prevented the country that emerged from October 1917 from drawing to itself the international revolutionary proletariat, who alone could save it. Huh? Sound useless to anyone else? And the clash between these two perspectives was inevitable. Kirov was assassinated on December 1st, 1934. The Franco-Soviet Pact was dated May 2nd, 1935. Trotsky's wide-ranging intervention, quoted above, Where is the Stalinist Bureaucracy Leading the USSR?, published on January 30th, 1935, stood between those two dates and was above all a harsh indictment against what Trotsky saw as a national and international neo-NEP. Okay, the next part here. Socialism without the dictatorship of the proletariat to the Cold War crackdown. The Great Terror and the terrible purge it entailed was followed by the Great Patriotic War. After the defeat of the Third Reich, Stalin, who foresaw a great future for the Great Alliance of anti-fascists and tried to prevent the outbreak of the Cold War, repeatedly declared, even in the course of confidential meetings with communist leaders in Eastern Europe, that at the time it was not a question of introducing the Soviet political model. It is possible that, if we had not had the war in the Soviet Union, the dictatorship of the proletariat would have taken on a different character. Unquote. The situation that arose in Eastern Europe after 1945 was clearly more favorable. In Poland, there is no dictatorship of the proletariat, and you do not need it. Must Poland follow the path of introducing the dictatorship of the proletariat? No, it does not have to. It is not necessary. And to the Bulgarian communist leaders, it is possible to achieve socialism in a new way without the dictatorship of the proletariat. The situation has changed radically from our revolution. It is necessary to apply different methods and forms. You need not fear accusations of opportunism. This is not opportunism, but the application of Marxism to the present situation. And to Tito, in our time, socialism is possible even under the English monarchy. Revolution is no longer necessary everywhere. Yes, socialism is possible even under an English king. The historian reporting these conversations commented in turn. As these remarks show, Stalin was actively rethinking the universal validity of the Soviet model of revolution and socialism. Perhaps one could go further and say that the rethinking also concerned the general relationship between socialism and democracy, with references therefore to the Soviet Union itself. To formulate the hypothesis of socialism under an English king was to question in some ways, if not the monopolistic concentration of power in the hands of the Communist Party. At any rate, the methods of terrorist dictatorship and autocracy. Symptomatic was the policy followed in the Soviet occupation zone in Germany. Quote, the Russians not only promoted socialist theater, ballet, opera, and cinema, they also promoted the bourgeois arts. And this in accordance with the program formulated in Moscow, according to which the Soviet system did not suit Germany, which was to be reorganized on the basis of broad anti-fascist and democratic principles. Thus, for the first 3 years after the war, there was no real cultural divisions in the capital, and the Soviet zone continued to take the lead in cultural matters. The outbreak of the Cold War abruptly interrupted this experience and this reflection. The central problem then became the creation of a security zone around a country deeply shattered by the Nazi aggression and occupation, in order to avoid a repetition of the tragedies of the recent past. While the question of dismantling, at least partially, the Gulag is posed in the USSR even before Stalin's demise, a real thaw was impossible. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviet Union had to engage in a new forced march in pursuit of the new Western technological revolution. It had freed itself from the German Western occupation, but could not allow itself any rest. A new, terrible threat had emerged. All the more so because a few years later, on November 1st, 1952, the explosion of the first hydrogen bomb, 1,000 times more powerful than those dropped on Japanese cities, took place. Quote, "When the American government announced the results of their test, there were reactions of shock and dismay in other parts of the world. It was obvious that such an extraordinarily powerful bomb could never be used against military targets. It was not a weapon of war. It could only be a weapon of genocide or political blackmail. Stalin received a report about the American test in the middle of November, and this only served to confirm his conviction that the United States was seriously preparing for war with the Soviet Union." Unquote. And that's Medvedev. A concern not unfounded. If one thinks that in January 1952, in order to break the deadlock in the military operations in Korea, Truman entertained the radical idea, which he also transcribed in a diary note, an ultimatum could be given to the USSR and the People's Republic of China, making it clear in advance that failure to comply means that Moscow, St. Petersburg, Mukden, Vladivostok, Peking, Shanghai, Port Arthur, Darien, Odessa, Stalingrad, and every manufacturing plant in China and the Soviet Union will be eliminated. Unquote. In the 3 historical decades of Stalin-led Soviet Russia, the main feature was not the blossoming of party dictatorship into autocracy, but rather the repeated attempts to move from the state of exception to a condition of relative normality. Attempts that failed because of reasons both internal, abstract utopia and messianism preventing a recognition of achievements, and international, the permanent threat hanging over the country in the wake of the October Revolution, and because of the intertwining of the two. And messianism itself is, on the other hand, an expression of tendencies intrinsic to Marxism, and on the other hand, a reaction to the horror of the First World War, which even in circles and personalities far removed from Marxism, aroused an aspiration to an absolutely new world, without any relation to a reality susceptible to the production and reproduction of this horror. With the outbreak of the Third Civil War among Bolsheviks, and with the simultaneous approach of the Second World War in Asia even before Europe, this series of failures eventually led to the advent of autocracy, exercised by a leader who became the object of a veritable cult. All right, last part for today. Bureaucracy or zealous faith? What idea can we form of the ruling group that achieved victory in the course of the Third Civil War, and tried to put an end to the Second Time of Troubles at the very moment when new gigantic storms were gathering on the horizon? We have seen that while Khrushchev, with torturous allusions, makes Kirov the victim of a conspiracy orchestrated by the Kremlin, Trotsky brands Kirov as an accomplice of the tyrant and as a leading exponent of the hatred, usurping parasitic bureaucracy, which was to be swept away once and for all by an invoked new revolution. But was it really a bureaucrat who was shot by Nikolaev? Let us return to the Russian scholar already mentioned, a critic of the Stalin-inspired assassination myth, to see how the victim was described. So who was Kirov? He was a loyal, outspoken, and dedicated leader. And that's not all. What characterized his personality was his attention to even the most minute problems in the daily lives of his colleague. With great modesty, he had a tolerance of opinions different from his own, respect for the culture and traditions of other peoples. This flattering judgment ends by casting a favorable light on the whole social environment frequented by Kirov, and, in the last analysis, on Stalin himself, of whom the former was a close and dedicated collaborator. We are by no means in the presence of a stratum of bureaucrats devoid of ideals and interested exclusively in their careers. Quote, like many leaders at the time, Kirov sincerely believed in the bright future for which he worked 18 to 20 hours a day. A convinced communist, he was so even when he sang Stalin's praises in the name of strengthening party and Soviet Union, of the country's development and power. This zealous faith was perhaps the tragedy of an entire generation. Unquote. In any case, it was the leadership as a whole that showed dedication to work and a spirit of sacrifice. We already know of the enormous workload that the Soviet leader managed to handle. Quote, at least during the war years, Stalin worked 14 to 15 hours a day in the Kremlin or at the dacha. In the autumn of 1946, Stalin traveled to the south to have a vacation for the first time since 1937. A few months from his death, and disregarding the urgent advice of doctors, Stalin refused to take a break in the autumn or winter of 1952, despite the enormous amount of time and effort he spent organizing the 19th Party Congress in October. Similar considerations can be made for a close collaborator of Stalin's, namely Lazar M. Kagnovich, who frequently deployed a frenetic commitment in directing the construction of the underground in Moscow. He went down directly into the quarries, even at night, to check on the work done and to get an idea of the state of the project. In conclusion, we are in the presence of a managerial group who, especially during the war years, was engaged in an almost superhuman effort. What animated them was a zealous faith that was not confined to this small group or even to the members of the Communist Party alone. Those showing missionary zeal were also ordinary men and women, on the whole. It was a period of genuine enthusiasm, of feverish exertion, and willing sacrifice. It was a spiritual climate that could be well understood if one bears in mind that the country was going through the stages of industrial development and was offering wide-range prospects for social advancement to large sections of the population, at a time when the surrounding capitalist world was immersed in a devastating crisis. Remember, this is the time of the Great Depression. We give the floor here to a historian who also used an interesting memoir for his analysis. Quote, The years 1928 to 31 were for the working class a period of enormous upward mobility. The promoters of socialist competition and superproductive Stocknovet workers not only replaced the cadres who were considered unsuitable, but filled vacancies en masse in the rapidly expanding bureaucratic apparatuses and educational institutions. They were not passively promoted, but active protagonists of promotion. They had a clear and definite goal for the present and the future, and sought to acquire knowledge and practical experience to the greatest extent possible, so as to be useful to the new society to the greatest extent possible. Unquote. The Stakhanovite movement and socialist competition, what DPRK calls socialist emulation drives, played a crucial role in the industrialization process. They helped the political leadership accelerate the pace of the process, to promote industrial modernization, to reorganize the factory troika along the lines of single management, and to select for promotion young, ambitious, competent, and politically trustworthy workers. The emergence of these workers as new forces had a trickle-down effect on the leaders of the party, industry, and union. The picture traced here is confirmed and further enriched by a very authoritative testimony in 1932. A very authoritative testimony. In 1932, from Riga, the capital of Latvia, a young man, an American diplomat, destined later to become famous as a theorist of Soviet containment, that is, George Kennan, sent a dispatch to Washington, offering a very interesting analysis. To begin with, he stressed that in the Soviet Union, life continues to be administered in the interests of a doctrine, namely communism. It is a worldview that could count on a wide consensus. The industrial proletariat enjoyed such a high social recognition that in its eyes it far outweighed the material disadvantages connected with a planned acceleration of economic development. Above all, the youth, or a certain portion of the youth, turned out to be extremely enthusiastic and happy, as can only be true in human beings completely immersed in tasks that have no relation to personal life. Unquote. That is, in human beings all caught up in an exalting project of building a new society. Think about this now in terms of DPRK, by the way. Also, in this sense, one could speak of the unlimited self-confidence, sanity, and happiness of the young Russian generation. But here a warning intervened which, in the light of subsequent historical experience, may be considered far-sighted. Quote, from being the most morally unified country in the world, Russia may turn at any moment into the worst moral chaos. Unquote. Can a condition of such strong moral tension withstand the wear and tear of time and the inevitable difficulties and failures of the project of building a new society? If not, it could easily reverse into the opposite. The fact remains that in 1932, and on the eve of Kirov's assassination, Soviet Russia presented itself in the eyes of the future theorist of containment as the most morally unified country in the world. Of course, when he expressed himself thus, Kennan seemed to know more about the urban context, where, despite contradictions and breakthrough, had in fact aroused the enthusiasm of a wide array of young people, intellectuals, and industrial workers, than that of the countryside. Here, the forced collectivization of agriculture had provoked, according to Bakurin's prescient warning, a St. Bartholomew's night for the rich peasants, and more generally, for an enormous number of peasants, very often belonging to national minorities. The result was a civil war waged ruthlessly and horribly on both sides. So ruthlessly and horribly that it drove a high ranking member of the Soviet military power to suicide. Shocked by an inspection in the course of which he was said to have repeatedly shouted that it was not communism but horror, unquote. It is probably this horror that provoked Bakurin's moral crisis, outraged by the large-scale St. Bartholomew's Night, against which he had warned in vain, horrified by the gigantic experiment in social engineering that proceeded without mercy, without distinguishing between person and a piece of wood. Even after the conclusion of the collectivization process, it was not persuasive to speak of a morally unified campaign, as if even the memory of the Civil War that had turned the bloodied it had vanished entirely. And yet, even with these necessary clarifications, Kennan's insistence on attachment to doctrine and enthusiasm makes us think of the zealous faith and missionary zeal already mentioned. Until the unleashing of the Great Terror in 1937, the picture did not change radically, at least according to the convergent analysis of an American and Russian historian. The first, even if he insisted on an aspect of top-down manipulation of public opinion, nevertheless observed that in 1935, Stalin enjoyed great popularity. Any attempt to overthrow his power would have come up against widespread resistance. In relation to the following year, the second, a militant anti-Stalinist historian, noted that, quote, the party and the majority of the people still trusted Stalin, unquote. Additionally, due to the fact that the standard of living, both urban and rural, rose appreciably, a certain enthusiasm spread. It was not only the rising standard of living that motivated such enthusiasm. There was much more. There was a real development of hitherto marginalized nations, the achievements of women, of legal equality with men, accompanied by an improvement in their social status. The emergence of a solid system of social protection, involving pensions, medical care, protection of pregnant women, family allowances, the considerable development of education, and of the intellectual sphere as a whole, with the extension of a network of libraries and reading rooms, and the spread of the taste for the arts, for poetry. It was a tumultuous event, an exultant of modernity, urbanization, the nuclear family, social mobility. These are processes that characterize the history of Soviet Russia as a whole, but that began to take off precisely in the Stalin years. The popular masses, traditionally condemned to illiteracy, burst massively into the schools and universities. Thus, a whole new generation of skilled workers and technically trained technicians and administrators was being formed, who were rapidly being called upon to perform a managerial function. New cities are founded, and old cities are rebuilt. The rise of gigantic new industrial complexes went hand in hand with the rise to a higher levels of social ladder, of able-bodied and ambitious citizens of working class or peasant origin. It has been said that in this connection that there was a mixture of brutal coercion and memorable heroism, disastrous folly, and spectacular results. But perhaps it is not even these achievements and their related economic improvements that constitute the main aspect, which can be found instead in the radical transformation that the places of production and work underwent in the transformation from the old to the new regime. Quote, in Tsarist Russia, employees demanded more respectful treatment from the master, insisting on the use of polite you instead of the familiar you, in which they saw a remnant of the old system of serfdom. They wanted to be treated as citizens, and often it was a question of respect for human dignity rather than wage demands that fueled workers' unrest and demonstrations. Unquote. After having long yearned for it and sought it in vain, the serfs had achieved recognition, in the Hegelian sense of the term, with the advent of Soviet power. And this applied not only to the workers, but also, as we shall see, to national minorities. It is this interweaving of spectacular results at the level of economic development on the one hand, and of the upheaval of the hierarchies of the ancient regime, confirmed by the unprecedented possibility of mobility and social advancement on the other, which stimulated in the mass of the population an exhilarating feeling. To the recognition already achieved as workers, there was about to be added their recognition as a unified Soviet people, who were on the verge of catching up with the more advanced countries, thus shaking off tradition and an image of backwardness. This explains the exhilarating feeling of participating in the construction of a new society and a new civilization, which was advancing in spite of mistakes, sacrifices, and terror. On the other hand, it is interesting to reread the indictment against the Soviet bureaucracy leadership formulated by Trotsky on the eve of the Great Terror. It was as if the indictment, which had previously seemed solid, was now so full of noticeable gaps and significant omissions that it actually contradicted itself.
Gigantic achievements in growing enormously promising beginnings in agriculture. An extraordinary growth of the old industrial cities and buildings of new ones. A rapid increase of the number of workers. A rise in the cultural level and cultural demands. Such are the indubitable results of the October Revolution, in which the prophets of the old world tried to see the grave of human civilization. With the bourgeois economists, we have no longer anything to quarrel. Stalinism has demonstrated its right to victory, not on the pages of Das Kapital, but in an industrial arena composing a sixth part of the Earth's surface. Thanks solely to the proletarian revolution, a backward country has achieved in less than 10 years successes unexampled in history.
Such a weird quote from Trotsky! Oh, there's more. With economic development came access to culture, not only for a new social strata, but also for entire people.
In the schools of the Soviet Union, lessons are taught at present in no less than 80 languages. For the majority of them, it is necessary to compose new alphabets or to replace the extremely aristocratic Asiatic alphabets with more democratic Latin.
Yeah, he said that. This is, by the way, this is why Stalin did do work on language. I just will say.
Newspapers are published in the same number of language papers, which for the first time acquaint the peasants and nomad shepherds with elementary ideas of human civilization. Within the far-flung boundaries of the Tsar's empire, a native industry is arising. The old semi-clan culture is being destroyed by the tractor. Together with literacy, scientific agriculture, and medicine are coming into existence. It would be difficult to overestimate the significance of this work of raising up a new human strata.
So weird how he calls For the majority of them, it is necessary to compose new alphabets or to replace the extremely aristocratic Asiatic alphabets with a more democratic Latin. Isn't that neat for Trotsky to say? At least as far as the established relationship with backwards nationalities, quote unquote, according to Trotsky, is concerned, the hated bureaucracy did, in spite of everything, some progressive work in laying down a bridge for them to the elementary benefits of bourgeoisie, and in part even pre-bourgeois culture. How, on the basis of such a framework, Trotsky could think that the anti-bureaucratic revolution was just around the corner remains a mystery. But this is not the point we are now interested in. The accolades that the leader of the opposition let slip are a symptom of the prestige and consensus still enjoyed by the Soviet leadership. Otherwise, one could not explain the spread of a new kind of Soviet patriotism, an undoubtedly very deep, sincere, dynamic sentiment. The period 1937 and 1938 was that of the Great Terror. Not even in the worst phase was there any withering of Stalin's regime's social base of consensus and enthusiastic followers, who continued to be motivated both by ideology and by chances for social advancement. It is a mistake to read the permanent consensus as a merely artifice of state censorship or repression. A paradoxical and tragic intertwining takes place as a consequence of the strong economic and cultural development on the one hand, and of the frightening gaps opened up by repression on the other. Tens of thousands of Stakhanovite workers became factory directors, and a similar, very rapid vertical mobility took place in the armed forces. On August 1939, during the negotiations for the Non-Aggression Pact, the chief translator of the German Foreign Ministry visited Moscow, and thus described the spectacle offered him by Red Square and the mausoleum dedicated to Lenin. Quote, "The long queue of Russian peasants waited patiently before this mausoleum to see Stalin's wax predecessor in his glassy tomb. By their attitude and their expressions on their faces, the Russians made the impression on me of devout pilgrims. Those who have been to Moscow and have not seen Lenin, a member of the embassy told me, are worth nothing to the rural Russian population." Unquote. The widespread veneration for Stalin's predecessor was also a symptom of the broad social base of consent the latter continued to enjoy. In any case, the deep splits caused by the Russian terror are at least in part healed by the patriotic unity that was welded together in the course of the resistance against Hitler's war of annihilation and enslavement. Certain it is that, we quote again, a historian not suspected of indulgence for communism and Stalinism, quote, "The victory increased to an unparalleled extent, not only the international prestige of the Soviet Union, but also the authority of the regime within the country, so that Stalin's popularity reached its peak in the years following the war. And this popularity remained unchanged until his death, and made itself felt even outside the Soviet Union, and even, to a certain extent, beyond the confines of the international communist movement." There you go. That's our read for today. We will continue this chapter next Thursday with a concentrationary universe full of contradictions. We'll continue learning about the Stalin period.